Some names aren't spoken to impress people, they're spoken because history still answers to them. The morning air carried the clean scent of salt and machine oil as visitors drifted across the Marine Corps Heritage Demonstration Grounds just outside Camp Pendleton, where polished vehicles sat beneath bright California sunshine and young Marines proudly explained equipment to families gathered behind waist-high barriers. Claire Bennett moved quietly through the crowd with both hands tucked into the pockets of a faded brown field jacket that looked older than many of the service members standing nearby. Her silver blonde hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and nothing about her appearance invited a second glance except the calm way she observed everything without ever seeming hurried. She paused beside a restored communications vehicle, studying an aging field radio displayed behind protective glass, her expression unreadable as memories flickered somewhere far behind her pale blue eyes. A few feet away, Corporal Ethan Brooks noticed her lingering near the exhibit and smiled with the easy confidence of someone who had spent enough time greeting tourists to believe he could read every person within seconds. He was young, sharp, freshly pressed in spotless camouflage utilities, and surrounded by several fellow Marines who laughed easily at his jokes while children pointed excitedly toward the military vehicles parked in neat rows stretching nearly 100 yards across the pavement. Ethan stepped forward with a friendly grin that slowly shifted into playful amusement. "Ma'am," he called, loud enough for nearby visitors to hear, "you look like you know your way around these old radios." Claire turned toward him with a polite nod but said nothing. Ethan folded his arms. "Let me guess. Army? Navy? Air Force? Everybody who hangs around these displays has a story." A couple standing nearby slowed their pace, curious enough to listen. Claire offered only a faint smile before looking back toward the display case. Ethan chuckled. "Come on, don't leave me hanging." His friends exchanged amused glances. "You veterans always have a nickname. What's your call sign?" Claire remained silent. The pause stretched just long enough for someone behind Ethan to laugh. "Maybe she never had one," another Marine joked. Ethan shrugged dramatically. "That's okay. You can make one up. We won't fact-check you." More quiet laughter rippled through the small audience now forming around the exchange. Claire finally met Ethan's eyes, not with irritation or embarrassment, but with the kind of patient expression usually reserved for someone much younger. She seemed less offended than thoughtful, as though deciding whether answering would help anyone at all. Ethan mistook her silence for uncertainty. "Seriously," he said, tilting his head with an easy grin. "What's the harm? Give us your call sign." The wind shifted across the concrete, carrying the distant rhythm of marching cadence from another part of the base. Somewhere beyond the exhibition tents, a helicopter crossed the coastline, its rotor hum blending into the steady conversations surrounding them. Claire glanced once toward the open sky before returning her attention to Ethan. Her voice, when it finally came, was soft enough that several people leaned closer just to hear it. "Why do you want to know?" Ethan laughed. "Because if you've really got one, I'd love to hear it." Claire studied his face for another long second, then lowered her eyes briefly as though opening a door that had remained closed for many years. Around them, conversations continued, cameras clicked, children laughed, and nobody noticed that one of the portable military radios resting on a nearby communications table had quietly illuminated a single waiting indicator. Claire took one calm breath, looked directly at the young Marine, and prepared to answer with only 2 words. Claire held Ethan Brooks's gaze for another heartbeat before answering in the same steady voice that never seemed to compete with the noise around her. "Raven 6. Nothing more. No explanation. No attempt to make the words sound important." They landed with almost no weight at all, disappearing beneath the laughter of the small crowd. Ethan blinked once before smiling even wider. "That is it?" he asked, looking toward the other Marines. "Raven 6? I was expecting something dramatic." A few chuckles circled through the visitors standing nearby. One father resting a hand on his young son's shoulder shrugged with a grin, assuming the exchange had reached its harmless conclusion. Claire simply nodded once, as though she had answered a perfectly ordinary question. She made no effort to defend herself or add another sentence. Ethan tilted his head with amused disbelief. You know, usually people have a story ready when they say something like that. Claire remained silent. The wind rolled gently across the demonstration area, stirring the flags above the display tents and carrying the distant sound of cadence calls from a training field somewhere beyond the public exhibits. The afternoon sun reflected off polished vehicle panels, creating bright flashes that danced across the pavement while visitors continued moving from one display to the next. Then a faint electronic chirp interrupted the laughter. Nobody reacted at first. Portable radios often produced random sounds during busy public events. Ethan barely noticed it. He had already turned halfway toward one of his fellow Marines, preparing another joke. A second tone followed, sharper this time. One of the communications specialists standing near the equipment table glanced down toward a field radio resting beside a folded map. The small indicator light that had quietly appeared moments earlier was no longer blinking. It had become a steady green. The specialist frowned. That is strange, he muttered under his breath. Ethan waved a casual hand. Probably somebody testing frequencies. Claire did not even look toward the radio. Her attention remained on the old communications display inside the glass case, where faded photographs and weathered headsets told stories that most visitors hurried past without reading. The specialist reached for the handset, expecting nothing more than routine static. Instead, the speaker released a burst of crisp interference unlike the ordinary background noise heard throughout the day. Conversations around the table slowed. Another Marine looked over. Did somebody request a channel check? Nobody answered. Ethan finally turned back toward the equipment, curiosity replacing his earlier amusement. What is going on? The specialist adjusted a dial carefully, listening without speaking. More static filled the air, followed by silence so complete that even nearby visitors instinctively lowered their voices. Claire still had not moved. She stood with relaxed shoulders, watching sunlight settle across the old radio inside the exhibit as though she already understood something no one else did. Ethan glanced back at her, then toward the equipment again. Ma'am, he said with an uncertain laugh, if this is some kind of coincidence, it is pretty good timing. Claire offered the smallest hint of a smile but gave no reply. Before anyone could speak again, every radio positioned along the communications table emitted the same clear activation tone within the span of a single second. Heads turned across the exhibit. Several Marines instinctively reached for their handsets. The specialist slowly lifted the nearest microphone, and before he could identify himself, a calm professional voice emerged from the speaker with unmistakable clarity. Station monitoring this frequency, verify the presence of Raven 6. The words floated through the warm California air, and every smile around Ethan Brooks quietly disappeared. The communications specialist tightened his grip on the handset without taking his eyes off the glowing display. For several long seconds, nobody answered. The voice that had emerged from the speaker was calm, measured, and unmistakably official, carrying none of the casual rhythm of routine radio traffic. Station monitoring this frequency, verify the presence of Raven 6. The request came again, identical to the first, neither louder nor more urgent, as though whoever was speaking expected an answer because an answer had always come before. Ethan Brooks looked from the radio to Claire Bennett, then back again, searching for the punchline that suddenly no longer existed. One of the younger Marines whispered, "Did they just say Raven 6?" Another nodded slowly without speaking. Visitors who had been walking toward the next exhibit stopped in place, sensing that something unusual had interrupted the afternoon even if they did not understand what it was. Claire remained exactly where she had been standing. Her posture did not change. She did not appear surprised, excited, or uncomfortable. Instead, she quietly studied the old communications equipment behind the glass display with the distant expression of someone listening to memories rather than voices. The specialist finally pressed the transmit button. "This is Demonstration Station Delta. Please identify your command." There was a brief burst of static before the reply arrived. "Negative. Verify Raven 6. The words were spoken with complete confidence, ignoring the question entirely. Ethan stepped closer to the table, his earlier grin gone. "Who is calling?" he asked softly. The specialist shook his head. "This frequency should not even be active today." Another Marine leaned over the equipment and checked the channel indicator twice before exchanging an uneasy glance with his partner. Everything appeared normal, yet nothing about the situation felt routine anymore. Ethan looked back toward Claire. "Ma'am," he said, this time with genuine uncertainty, "have you heard that call sign before?" Claire slowly turned her head toward him. Her pale blue eyes carried the quiet patience that had never left them. "Yes," she answered simply. Ethan waited for more, but no explanation followed. Around them, the atmosphere continued changing in subtle ways. The easy laughter that had filled the exhibit only minutes earlier faded into cautious silence. Parents gently guided curious children a little closer, while several older visitors exchanged puzzled looks as if trying to remember something almost forgotten. A retired Marine wearing a faded campaign cap narrowed his eyes the moment he heard the words Raven 6 repeated across the speaker. His expression shifted from curiosity to recognition, though he said nothing. The communications specialist adjusted the volume one final time. Before he could transmit again, another voice entered the channel. It was different from the first, older and lower, carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "All stations, maintain current position. Do not terminate the connection." Every Marine standing near the table instinctively straightened. Ethan felt the change immediately. Nobody had issued a direct order to him, yet years of training surfaced on their own. The older voice continued. "Confirm visual identification only. Do not interrupt the individual." Ethan slowly turned toward Claire once more. She had begun walking at an unhurried pace toward the next display, her footsteps steady against the concrete as sunlight reflected softly across the weathered leather strap of the small satchel resting at her side. She neither looked back nor acknowledged the radios continuing to call after her. For the first time since joining the Marine Corps, Ethan realized he was no longer leading the conversation. He was simply trying to keep up with a story that had started many years before he ever put on the uniform. Claire Bennett continued walking at the same unhurried pace, following the shaded path between the heritage displays as though the unexpected voices on the radios belonged to another lifetime instead of the present afternoon. The leather strap across her shoulder shifted gently with each step while warm ocean air carried the distant cry of gulls overhead. Behind her, the communications table had become the quiet center of attention. Marines who had been explaining equipment to visitors only minutes before now stood shoulder to shoulder, watching every movement without fully understanding why. Ethan Brooks remained frozen beside the radios, replaying the last few moments in his mind. Nothing about the woman matched the image he had built from his first impression. She had arrived alone, wearing no insignia, no medals, no clothing that suggested authority. Yet every voice coming across the radio spoke as though her presence mattered far beyond a public demonstration. The older transmission returned with the same measured confidence. Maintain observation only. Additional personnel are en route. Repeat, do not interfere. The communications specialist slowly lowered the microphone, careful not to interrupt another transmission. His expression had changed completely. Earlier he had treated the strange signal as a technical curiosity. Now he treated it like an instruction that deserved immediate respect. Ethan finally broke the silence. Who would issue an order like that over an open demonstration channel? Nobody answered. Nobody could. Another Marine quietly checked the frequency list clipped beside the radio and frowned. The channel displayed on the screen did not belong to the public event schedule. According to the printed assignment sheet, it should not have been receiving outside traffic at all. One visitor pulled out a phone, hoping to record whatever was happening, but lowered it again after noticing the unusual seriousness spreading among the Marines. Even the children who had been climbing over display barriers under their parents' supervision became unusually quiet as conversations faded into whispers. Claire stopped beside an older exhibit featuring photographs from humanitarian missions and disaster relief operations completed decades earlier. Her eyes rested on one faded image showing a temporary communications station assembled under difficult conditions. The picture had yellowed with age, yet something about it seemed familiar enough to hold her attention. She reached out but stopped just short of touching the glass. Her reflection blended with the old photograph for only a moment before she quietly withdrew her hand. Behind her, another radio activated. This time the voice belonged to someone younger, though equally disciplined. Operations has confirmed archival authentication is in progress. Continue visual confirmation. Estimated arrival, 12 minutes. Ethan felt a chill despite the comfortable afternoon temperature. Archival authentication. He had heard the phrase only once during training, used when historical records required formal verification rather than ordinary identification. He looked toward Claire again with entirely different eyes. The retired Marine wearing the faded campaign cap stepped closer to Ethan and spoke so softly that only he could hear. "Son, stop trying to figure out who she says she is." Ethan looked at the older man. "Then what am I supposed to figure out?" The veteran kept his eyes fixed on Claire before answering. "Figure out why people with voices like that already know." Ethan followed his gaze. Claire still stood alone before the display, calm and completely unaware of the attention gathering behind her, or perhaps fully aware and simply unwilling to encourage it. The wind lifted the edge of her weathered jacket as another helicopter passed high above the coastline, its distant rotor hum blending with the steady rhythm of waves beyond the base. For everyone else, it was simply another beautiful afternoon at Camp Pendleton. For Claire Bennett, it felt as though a door sealed many years earlier had quietly begun opening once again. Claire stood quietly before the weathered photograph, her reflection blending with the faded image of canvas shelters, field antennas, and exhausted faces frozen in time. The old picture showed a temporary communications station built from little more than determination and improvisation, its operators surrounded by battered equipment that looked primitive beside the polished displays visitors admired today. Most people glanced at the photograph for only a few seconds before moving on. Claire had not moved in nearly a minute. The distant rotor hum above Camp Pendleton slowly dissolved into another sound that only she seemed able to hear, a memory carried not by the wind but by a single forgotten call sign. The warm California afternoon gave way inside her mind to damp mountain air and endless gray clouds hanging low over unfamiliar ridgelines many years earlier. The radios had sounded different then, heavier, rougher, filled with static that never completely disappeared. Every message mattered because every word consumed precious seconds. Young operators sat shoulder to shoulder inside a temporary communications shelter assembled from camouflage netting and portable equipment, passing information with disciplined precision while generators rumbled beyond the perimeter. Claire had been much younger, her hair tucked beneath a simple cap, headphones resting over focused eyes that rarely left the signal board in front of her. Nobody wasted words. Nobody needed speeches. Call signs carried entire identities because names were secondary to responsibility. Raven 6 was never spoken loudly. It was acknowledged quietly, passed from one station to another with immediate understanding. Whenever the words reached the network, conversations changed. Priorities shifted. Experienced operators straightened instinctively because they understood exactly what that designation represented. Claire remembered one long evening when multiple channels had fallen silent almost simultaneously before a calm senior controller had spoken only 3 words. Raven 6 confirmed. Every operator inside the shelter had looked toward her without surprise or celebration. They simply returned to work because trust had already been earned long before that transmission. The memory faded as gently as it had arrived. Claire blinked once and found herself standing once again beneath bright California sunshine with tourists strolling past historic exhibits. Behind her, the modern radios continued exchanging careful, professional traffic. Ethan Brooks watched from several yards away, unable to understand why the quiet woman seemed completely untouched by the growing attention surrounding her. He noticed the way she looked at the old communications display, not with nostalgia alone but with the quiet recognition of someone seeing former teammates through objects that had survived after people had moved on. The retired Marine standing beside Ethan folded his arms while studying Claire with thoughtful eyes. "Some people spend their whole careers trying to become unforgettable," he said softly. "Others spend the rest of their lives hoping nobody remembers." Ethan frowned. If she really was connected to something important, why would she never mention it? The older veteran smiled faintly. Because the people who truly carried responsibility usually stopped talking about it the moment the mission ended. Another transmission interrupted the silence. Operations update. Historical verification continuing. Maintain respectful observation. Senior command has acknowledged the request. This time no one reacted with confusion. The unusual had gradually become accepted. The specialist monitoring the equipment no longer searched for technical explanations. Instead, he carefully documented each transmission exactly as received. Claire finally stepped away from the photograph and continued walking through the exhibit at the same calm pace she had maintained since arriving that morning. She neither hurried toward the attention gathering behind her nor tried to escape it. She simply kept moving, as though every step reminded her that history was never something carried on a uniform. Sometimes it traveled quietly inside a single voice, waiting years before someone unknowingly spoke the one call sign capable of waking it again. Claire Bennett had almost reached the end of the communications exhibit when the rhythm of the afternoon changed again. It was subtle at first, almost impossible for the visitors to notice. Marines positioned throughout the demonstration area quietly touched the earpieces of their radios one after another, each receiving the same brief instruction. None of them raised their voices. None of them hurried. Yet within moments they naturally adjusted their positions, creating a respectful corridor without blocking the public walkway or drawing unnecessary attention. Ethan Brooks watched the quiet coordination unfold with growing disbelief. Nobody had announced an emergency. No alarms had sounded. Still, every experienced Marine seemed to understand that something important was developing. The communications specialist received another transmission and listened without interrupting. His expression remained composed, but he stood a little straighter before answering. Understood. Visual contact maintained. He lowered the microphone and looked toward Ethan. Senior command requested that we ensure our guest is comfortable. Ethan frowned. Guest? The specialist nodded once. That was the exact word they used. Ethan glanced toward Claire again. She had stopped beside a bronze memorial plaque listing the names of communication units that had served across different decades. Her fingertips rested lightly against the edge of the stone without covering a single engraved letter. She quietly read every line with the patience of someone greeting old friends rather than studying history. The retired Marine wearing the faded campaign cap slowly walked toward her. When he reached the memorial, he removed his cap without saying a word. Claire looked up, recognized the gesture, and returned a gentle nod. Nothing more was exchanged. Ethan had expected introductions or questions, but silence somehow carried greater meaning than conversation. Nearby visitors noticed the respectful exchange and instinctively lowered their own voices. A young girl tugged gently on her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Who is that lady?" Her mother smiled apologetically. "I do not know." The retired Marine quietly answered without taking his eyes from the memorial. Some stories are remembered by people instead of books. The little girl looked at Claire with innocent curiosity before squeezing her mother's hand again. Another transmission arrived through the radios. Historical verification complete. Identity confirmed through archived operational records. The words settled over the area with remarkable calm. Nobody celebrated. Nobody gasped. Instead, several Marines exchanged brief glances that carried equal parts surprise and respect. Ethan felt the weight of every joke he had made only minutes earlier. He replayed each careless smile, each playful remark, wishing he had approached the quiet woman differently. Yet Claire herself showed no sign that she had been offended. She continued reading the memorial exactly as before, seemingly more interested in the names carved into bronze than in the growing attention surrounding her. The communications specialist received one final update before carefully placing the handset back onto its cradle. Senior representatives are 5 minutes away. Ethan looked toward the entrance road beyond the exhibition grounds where several government vehicles had just appeared in the distance, moving at ordinary speed without flashing lights or unnecessary display. Their arrival seemed almost deliberately understated. The retired Marine quietly replaced his cap and smiled to himself. "That is how respect usually arrives," he said softly. "It does not need an audience." Ethan followed his gaze toward Claire. For the first time that afternoon, he understood that everything happening around her had begun long before anyone at the demonstration had recognized her face. The radios had not created her reputation. They had merely awakened a network of people who had never forgotten the quiet woman standing beneath the California sun, patiently reading names that meant far more to her than her own. The government vehicles rolled quietly through the entrance without sirens or flashing lights, attracting attention only because of the calm precision with which they stopped along the curb. Visitors instinctively stepped aside, their conversations fading into whispers as several senior officers emerged in neatly pressed service uniforms. None of them hurried. Their measured pace suggested experience rather than urgency. Ethan Brooks watched with growing disbelief as every Marine near the communications exhibit straightened almost automatically. Claire Bennett remained where she was, standing before the bronze memorial with her eyes resting on the engraved names. She did not turn immediately. The wind carried the scent of the Pacific across the open grounds while the flags above the display moved gently against a cloudless afternoon sky. One of the senior officers paused several yards behind her instead of calling out. For a long moment, the only sound came from distant helicopter rotors and the quiet murmur of families exploring the exhibits. Claire finally turned, recognizing the officer with the faintest smile, as though they had simply met again after many years apart. The officer returned the smile with genuine warmth before offering a respectful greeting. Neither of them raised a voice. Those standing nearby could not hear every word, yet the tone alone revealed years of shared history built on trust instead of rank. Ethan remained still, uncertain whether to approach or remain where he was. The retired Marine beside him spoke softly without looking away. "Sometimes respect is not announced. It is remembered." Ethan nodded almost unconsciously. Everything he believed he understood about leadership seemed to be shifting in front of him. The communications specialist quietly secured the radios, their displays now dark and silent after the earlier transmissions. It felt as though the equipment had completed the only task it had been waiting to perform. The senior officer glanced toward the memorial before returning his attention to Claire. "It is good to see you again," he said. Claire answered with the same calm humility that had marked every word she had spoken that afternoon. "It is good to know the names are still remembered." The officer followed her gaze to the bronze plaque. "They always will be." Around them, visitors continued walking through the exhibits, most unaware that they had just witnessed the reunion of people connected by events that had long since become part of history. There were no dramatic speeches, no applause, and no attempt to explain every detail. The quiet dignity of the moment needed none of those things. Ethan finally stepped forward, stopping several feet away before speaking carefully. "Ma'am," he said, his confidence replaced by sincere respect. "I owe you an apology." Claire looked at him kindly, her expression unchanged. "You asked a question," she replied. "There is nothing wrong with asking." Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. "I should have listened to the answer differently." Claire smiled, not because she had won anything, but because she understood that humility often arrived through experience rather than instruction. The afternoon continued beneath the California sun, yet for Ethan Brooks the day had become something far greater than another public assignment. He had come expecting to teach visitors about history. Instead, history had quietly walked past him, answered one simple question, and reminded everyone nearby that the greatest stories are often carried by the people who speak about them the least. The senior officer remained beside Claire Bennett for another quiet moment before reaching into the inside pocket of his service coat and removing a small, weathered challenge coin. Its edges had been worn smooth by time, and the emblem stamped into the metal had faded from years of careful handling rather than display. He held it in his open palm for a second before offering it to Claire without ceremony. She looked at the coin, smiled gently, and closed his hand around it instead of accepting it. "It belongs with you now," she said softly. The officer nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Some things were not passed forward because they were valuable. They were carried because they represented promises that continued long after missions had ended. Ethan Brooks watched the exchange with quiet fascination. Nothing about the moment resembled the dramatic recognition he might have imagined only an hour earlier. There were no speeches celebrating extraordinary accomplishments, no detailed accounts of classified operations, and no attempt to impress the growing crowd. Instead, the respect shared between the two came from memories that required no explanation. Visitors continued strolling through the heritage grounds, many unaware that history had briefly stepped into the present only a few yards away. Those who had witnessed the earlier radio transmissions sensed that something meaningful had occurred even if they could not describe it. The retired Marine wearing the faded campaign cap slowly approached Claire. He extended his hand, and she accepted it with a warm smile. "I never thought I would hear that call sign again," he admitted quietly. Claire looked toward the memorial plaque before answering. "Neither did I." The older veteran nodded toward the engraved names. "Some of them would be glad you came back." Claire lowered her eyes for a brief moment. "I think they never really left." A comfortable silence settled between them, filled only by the distant sound of waves rolling against the California shoreline beyond the base. Nearby, the communications specialist finished securing the equipment. Before closing the final radio case, he paused and looked once more at the display screen that had carried the unexpected transmissions. The indicator lights were dark again, ordinary once more, as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet everyone who had heard those voices understood that the radios had done exactly what they were supposed to do. They had recognized someone whose service had never been forgotten. Ethan finally gathered enough courage to step closer. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "I realize now that I judged you before I knew anything about you." Claire met his eyes with the same calm expression she had carried throughout the afternoon. "We all make quick decisions sometimes," she replied. "The important part is deciding what we learn afterward." Ethan nodded slowly. "I will remember that." The senior officer glanced toward him with an approving smile. "That lesson will serve you longer than any manual." The afternoon sun drifted lower across the heritage grounds, casting long shadows from the historic vehicles onto the pavement. Families continued taking photographs, children pointed excitedly toward helicopters in the distance, and conversations gradually returned to their normal rhythm. Yet the atmosphere had changed in a way that could not be measured. The laughter that had once followed Claire's quiet answer had been replaced by thoughtful respect. Nobody asked another question about her call sign. Nobody needed to. The two simple words she had spoken had already revealed everything that truly mattered, not because they described who she was, but because they reminded everyone present that genuine honor is recognized most clearly by those who have learned to value quiet service above loud recognition. The afternoon slowly settled into its familiar rhythm as golden sunlight stretched across the heritage grounds, turning polished vehicles and memorial plaques into quiet reflections of another generation's service. Visitors gradually returned to their conversations, children laughed again as they explored the exhibits, and the distant sound of helicopter rotors blended naturally with the steady breeze rolling in from the Pacific. Claire Bennett looked once more at the bronze memorial before taking a slow breath and adjusting the worn leather strap resting on her shoulder. There was nothing left for her to explain because the day had never been about proving who she was. It had simply become a reminder that some stories continue living long after the people inside them stop telling them. The senior officer extended his hand one final time. Claire accepted it with a warm smile before they quietly parted, each understanding that respect required no ceremony when it had already been earned years before. Ethan Brooks stepped aside to clear the walkway as Claire approached. This time there was no uncertainty in his posture and no trace of the playful confidence that had started the afternoon. He stood with genuine humility. "Thank you," he said sincerely. Claire paused. "For what?" Ethan looked toward the communications exhibit where the silent radios now rested inside their cases. "For reminding me that a uniform is only part of someone's story." Claire smiled gently. "And sometimes not even the most important part." Ethan nodded, carrying those words with a seriousness that surprised even himself. He knew he would remember them every time he met another visitor, another veteran, or another stranger whose life could never be understood by appearance alone. The retired Marine in the faded campaign cap watched Claire begin walking toward the parking area before quietly placing his cap back on his head. He glanced at Ethan with a faint smile. "Now you understand why the old-timers always tell young Marines to listen before they judge." Ethan returned a respectful smile. "Yes, sir. I do now." Nearby, the communications specialist closed the final equipment case and completed the day's report. Under the section describing unusual activity, he paused for a brief moment before writing only a single sentence. "Historical identification successfully confirmed." Nothing more seemed necessary. Some events explained themselves. Claire continued along the sidewalk beneath rows of American flags moving gently in the afternoon wind. She never looked back toward the exhibit because she did not need to. The people she had quietly honored that day remained with her exactly as they always had, carried not through recognition or ceremony but through memory and quiet gratitude. As she reached the parking lot, a faint tone emerged from a handheld radio resting inside one of the communications vehicles parked nearby. No one else appeared to notice it. The speaker came alive for only a brief second before returning to silence. A calm voice spoke just 5 simple words. "Raven 6, thank you once again." Claire closed her eyes for the briefest moment, smiled almost imperceptibly, and continued walking beneath the warm California sky without answering. She no longer needed to. The message had never required a reply. Behind her, life at the heritage grounds carried on exactly as before, yet everyone who had witnessed the afternoon understood something they had not known when the day began. History does not always arrive wearing medals. Sometimes it stands quietly beside an old radio, answers one simple question with 2 ordinary words, and then walks away before anyone realizes they have just met someone whose greatest accomplishments were never meant to become the loudest part of their life. Some names fade with time, but true respect has a way of remembering exactly when to answer.